Before empires, before borders, before oil and warships, there was heat. The land around the Strait of Hormuz did not welcome people easily. It pressed down on them. The sun rose harsh and white over a horizon of rock and dust, baking the earth until it shimmered. Even the wind, when it came, carried no relief, only more heat, dry and relentless, sweeping across jagged coastlines and empty plains. To the north lay the lands of ancient Mesopotamia, where the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, fed the first cities. But further south and east, where the narrow channel of water connected the Persian Gulf to the wider ocean, the world grew harsher. The mountains of southern Persia dropped steeply toward the sea, their shadows offering brief escape from the furnace-like days. And yet, people came. At dawn, fishermen pushed out onto calm waters in simple wooden boats. The sea was quieter then, almost glass-like, reflecting the pale sky as it slowly turned gold. The air carried the scent of salt and drying nets, mixed with the faint smoke of cooking fires from small coastal settlements. By midday, everything changed. The water darkened under the weight of the sun. Waves grew sharper. The cries of seabirds echoed against the cliffs. Men wrapped cloth around their heads and faces, shielding themselves from the glare, their skin hardened by years of exposure. But it was at night that the region revealed something else entirely. When the heat finally loosened its grip, the sky opened. Far from the lights of any city, the night sky above ancient Mesopotamia and the waters beyond was overwhelming, dense with stars, stretching endlessly from horizon to horizon. Constellations burned bright and clear, guiding early sailors and traders across unfamiliar waters. The Milky Way cut a pale path overhead, like a river mirroring those on land. For those early travellers, the stars were more than beauty. They were direction, survival. And between these extremes, blistering days and vast, silent nights, the Strait of Hormuz began its story. Though no one called it that yet, it was simply a passage, a narrow opening between landmasses where waters flowed in and out, linking distant worlds. Small boats carried goods along its edges, grains, pottery, textiles. Over time, those routes stretched further. Traders from the Indus Valley began to appear. Goods moved not just between nearby villages, but between civilizations. The people who lived along these shores understood something early. This harsh, unforgiving place held power. Not power in the form of fertile soil or abundant water, but in connection. Everything that moved between the great civilizations of the ancient world, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the lands beyond, could pass through here. A narrow strip of sea, easily overlooked on a map, yet impossible to ignore in practice. Empires would rise far from its shores, but they would all come to depend on it. At this early stage, there were no fortresses guarding its waters, no fleets competing for dominance, only small communities navigating tides, reading the stars, and learning, slowly, that they stood at the edge of something far greater than themselves. The Strait of Hormuz was not yet a battleground, it was a beginning. By the early medieval period, the lands surrounding the Strait of Hormuz had already witnessed centuries of trade, migration, and quiet transformation. But with the rise of the great Islamic caliphates, something shifted. The region was no longer just a meeting point of cultures. It became part of a vast, unified system stretching from the Atlantic shores of North Africa to the distant edges of Central Asia. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, trade flourished. Stability, relative security, and shared language and religion created conditions that allowed commerce to thrive. Ports along the Persian Gulf expanded. Markets grew louder, busier, more diverse. Merchants from across the known world, Arab, Persian, Indian, and East African, passed through these waters, carrying spices, silk, ivory, and precious metals. The strait itself became something more than a geographical feature. It was a hinge, connecting the Indian Ocean trade routes with the economic heartlands of the Middle East. Ships moved with the rhythm of the monsoon winds, arriving heavy with goods and departing just as full. Navigation was an art guided by stars, experience, and inherited knowledge passed from one generation of sailors to the next. At night, the decks of these vessels would be quiet but for the creak of wood and the soft slap of water against the hull. Above, the same vast canopy of stars that had guided ancient mariners continued to serve as their map. The journey was long, often dangerous, but predictable enough to sustain a network that would endure for centuries. This was the golden age of Indian Ocean trade, and the Strait of Hormuz sat directly at its centre. But far beyond these waters, in Europe, a different story was unfolding. By the late 15th century, European powers, particularly Portugal, were searching for direct access to the riches of the East. Overland routes were slow, expensive, and often controlled by rival powers. The solution, they believed, lay at sea. When Portuguese ships finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, they brought with them something new. Not just trade, but force. Armed with cannons and driven by ambition, they began to establish a chain of fortified positions along key maritime routes. Their goal was simple: to control the flow of goods, not merely participate in it, and inevitably their attention turned to the Strait of Hormuz. In the early 16th century, under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese moved decisively. Recognizing the strategic importance of the region, they launched an Abyan to seize control of Hormuz Island, a critical point overlooking the narrow passage. The takeover was swift, but its implications were profound. Soon after, construction began on a formidable stronghold, the Fort of Our Lady of the Conception. Built of stone and positioned to dominate the surrounding waters, the fort was both a defensive structure and a symbol. It signalled a new reality. The strait was no longer just a corridor of exchange. It was contested ground. From this base, the Portuguese imposed their authority. Ships passing through the strait were required to pay duties. Resistance was met with force. What had once been a relatively open system of trade now operated under the watchful eye of a distant European power. But this control was never absolute. Local rulers, particularly in Persia, viewed the Portuguese presence as an intrusion, an unacceptable disruption to a region that had long been shaped by its own networks and traditions. Tensions simmered, occasionally boiling over into open conflict. Over time, alliances formed. Persian forces determined to reclaim influence worked alongside other powers to challenge Portuguese dominance. The struggle was not just military, but economic and symbolic. Control of the strait meant control of the region's lifeblood, and slowly the balance began to shift. The Portuguese, though formidable, were far from home. Their resources were stretched across a global empire. Maintaining control over distant strongholds proved increasingly difficult. Bit by bit their grip weakened, but the precedent had been set. The Strait of Hormuz had entered a new phase of its history, one defined not just by trade, but by competition, conflict, and the growing realization that this narrow passage could shape the fortunes of empires. It would not be the last time. By the mid-17th century, the balance of power around the Strait of Hormuz was beginning to shift. The Portuguese, once so dominant, were no longer the unstoppable force they had seemed a century earlier. Their empire, stretched thin across Africa, Asia, and South America, was struggling to maintain control. Distant outposts became harder to defend, supplies grew inconsistent, and perhaps most importantly, they were no longer the only European power in the game. In 1622, a decisive moment arrived. Persian forces, working in alliance with the English East India Company, launched a determined campaign to expel the Portuguese from Hormuz Island. The great fortress, that had once symbolized European dominance fell. Control of the island shifted back to regional hands. It marked the end of one era, but the beginning of another. Because while the Portuguese declined, the British were just getting started. At first, their presence was subtle. Unlike their predecessors, they did not immediately impose direct military control over the strait. Instead, they focused on influence, on relationships, agreements, and strategic positioning. Through the British Empire and its commercial arms, they embedded themselves within the existing trade networks. Ports were not conquered, they were partnered. Rulers were not overthrown, they were negotiated with. It was a quieter form of power, but no less effective. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the British had become the dominant external force in the Persian Gulf. Their primary concern was not just profit, but stability. The sea lanes connecting India, then the jewel of their empire, to Britain itself had to remain open, secure, and predictable. The Strait of Hormuz was central to this mission. Naval patrols increased, treaties were signed with local leaders. Piracy, once a persistent threat, was aggressively suppressed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the waters of the Gulf and the narrow passage that connected them to the wider ocean came under British protection. But this was not altruism, it was strategy, because the world was changing again. The Industrial Revolution was transforming economies across Europe. Factories demanded raw materials, steamships required fuel, global trade accelerated at a pace never seen before, and with this rapid expansion came a new kind of resource, one that would redefine the importance of the region entirely: oil. In the early 20th century, vast reserves of oil were discovered beneath the land surrounding the Persian Gulf. At first, its potential was only partially understood, but as internal combustion engines replaced steam power and as navies transitioned from coal to oil, its value became undeniable. The Strait of Hormuz, once a route for spices and silk, was now something else entirely. It was the gateway to energy. Tankers began to replace traditional cargo ships. Massive, slow-moving vessels carried crude oil from ports deep within the Gulf, passing through the narrow strait on their way to markets in Europe, Asia, and beyond. The scale was staggering. What had once been regional trade was now global infrastructure, and the strait sat at its heart. Its geography, narrow, constrained, unavoidable, made it both efficient and fragile. A disruption here would not just affect a single region, it would ripple across the entire world. The British understood this. Throughout the early 20th century, they worked to maintain their influence, ensuring that the flow of oil and the stability of the routes it depended on remained intact. Naval power, diplomacy, and economic leverage were all brought to bear in service of this goal. But even as they did so, the nature of the strait was changing. It was no longer simply a strategic asset, it was a choke point, a place where the vast machinery of global industry narrowed into a single, vulnerable passage. A place where geography dictated power, where control, or even disruption, could shift the balance of economies far beyond its shores. And as new powers emerged on the world stage, the importance of that narrow strip of water would only grow. The age of empire had shaped the Strait of Hormuz. The age of oil would make it indispensable. By the mid-20th century, the Strait of Hormuz had become something far more than a trade route. It was now a pressure point. During the Cold War, the world was divided into rival blocs, each watching the other, each preparing for a conflict that somehow never fully came. But while the confrontation between superpowers remained mostly indirect, places like the Strait of Hormuz sat quietly at the centre of their calculations, because energy meant power, and power depended on oil. The nations surrounding the Persian Gulf held vast reserves of it, and the strait was the narrow gateway through which much of that oil had to pass. Western economies relied on it, militaries depended on it, entire industrial systems were built around it, so the question became unavoidable. What would happen if that flow stopped? The answer was simple and terrifying. Everything would feel it. For the United States and its allies, keeping the strait open became a strategic priority. Naval presence increased, surveillance intensified. Warships moved through the region not as invaders, but as guardians of a fragile system. But stability, as it turned out, was an illusion. In 1979, everything changed. The Iranian Revolution overturned the existing order in Iran, replacing a Western-aligned monarchy with a new, deeply independent regime. Almost overnight, the tone of the region shifted. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just an economic artery, it was a political lever, and the world took notice. Just 1 year later, war erupted. The Iran-Iraq War would become one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the late 20th century. At first, it was fought largely on land, trenches, artillery, grinding advances. But as the war dragged on, both sides began to look outward, toward the sea. By the early 1980s, a new phase had begun, the so-called tanker war. It started slowly. Iraq, seeking to cripple Iran's economy, began targeting oil infrastructure and ships carrying Iranian exports. The aim was not just destruction but pressure to force Iran into a response that might draw in global powers. At first, Iran held back, but by 1984 restraint gave way to retaliation. What followed was a brutal, escalating campaign of attacks across the Persian Gulf. Oil tankers, once symbols of global commerce, became targets. Missiles struck hulls, mines drifted unseen beneath the surface. Fast attack boats darted through the water, launching sudden, unpredictable assaults. It didn't matter whose oil was being carried. If it was connected to the enemy, it was at risk. By the peak of the conflict, hundreds of ships had been hit. Some burned for days, others sank slowly beneath the surface. Crews, often civilian, found themselves on the front lines of a war they had no part in starting. And always, looming over it all, was the strait, narrow, inescapable, vulnerable. There were fears, constant, growing fears, that Iran might attempt to close it entirely. Iraq, in fact, had hoped to provoke exactly that kind of decisive escalation, believing it would force foreign intervention. But the closure never came. Instead, the danger remained something more unpredictable, a slow burn of violence. The United States, unwilling to risk disruption to global oil supplies, stepped in. Naval escorts were introduced. Kuwaiti tankers were reflagged under the American flag, bringing them under US protection. And with that, the strait became militarized in a way it never had been before. Warships shadowed tankers. Helicopters scanned the waters for mines. Tension hung thick in the air. Every radar signal, every unidentified vessel, a potential threat. Then, in 1988, the situation reached a breaking point. After an American warship struck an Iranian mine, the United States launched a powerful retaliatory operation, crippling much of Iran's naval capacity in a single day. The message was clear. The strait would not be closed, but the cost of keeping it open had changed. By the end of the war, the waters of the Persian Gulf, and especially the Strait of Hormuz, were no longer just commercial space. They were militarized corridors, zones of surveillance, tension, and constant readiness. The old world of trade had not disappeared, but it now moved under the shadow of conflict, and the strait, once a quiet passage guided by stars, had become something else entirely, a place where the stability of the global economy could hinge on a single spark. Today, the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just important, it is indispensable. Every day, under normal conditions, a steady flow of tankers moves through this narrow stretch of water, slow, deliberate, immense. Together they carry around 1/5 of the world's oil supply, a staggering volume that fuels cities, industries, and entire economies across the globe. It is difficult to overstate what that means. Cars moving through Tokyo, factories running in China, planes lifting into the sky over Europe, Much of it, in some way, depends on this single passage, and yet the strait itself is fragile. At its narrowest, it is only a few dozen kilometres wide. Shipping lanes are tightly controlled and there is little room for error, and even less room for conflict. But conflict has a way of finding it. In the 21st century, tensions between Iran, the United States and neighbouring Gulf states have turned the strait into a constant pressure point. Warships patrol its waters, drones scan from above, every movement is watched, tracked, calculated, and sometimes challenged. There have been moments when oil tankers are seized, redirected or detained, moments when naval vessels shadow one another at close range, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Moments when warnings are issued over radio channels, sharp and formal, cutting through the still air above the sea. To an outside observer, it can seem like a standoff frozen in time. But it is anything but static. Even small incidents send shockwaves outward. A single disruption, one damaged tanker, one blocked lane, can push oil prices higher within hours. Markets react instantly. Governments respond just as quickly. We've seen it happen. Recent tensions have shown how quickly the situation can escalate. Periods of heightened conflict in the region have led to disruptions in shipping through the strait, sending oil prices soaring and threatening global supply chains. And the impact goes far beyond fuel. When the strait is threatened, it is not just oil that is affected. Natural gas shipments are disrupted. Supply chains tighten. Even industries like agriculture and manufacturing begin to feel the strain as costs rise and materials become harder to move. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy corridor, it is a global lifeline. What makes it especially dangerous is that there are few true alternatives. Pipelines exist, but they cannot match the scale of what flows through the strait each day. Most of the oil produced in the Persian Gulf still has to pass through this narrow channel to reach the world, which means one thing: dependency, and dependency creates risk. For Iran, the strait represents leverage, a way to exert influence far beyond its borders. For the United States and its allies, it represents vulnerability, a point that must be protected at all costs. For the global economy, it represents uncertainty. The strait continues to function. Ships still pass, oil still flows, the system, fragile as it is, still holds. From ancient sailors navigating by stars to modern tankers guided by satellite systems, the essence of this place has never changed. It remains what it has always been, a narrow passage upon which the wider world depends, a place small in size but immense in consequence. The Strait of Hormuz is not just part of history, it is where history is still being written.